Okay, so what we are going to do is to take you through all the pieces in the exhibition. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box and then we'll take time and go through all of them. So the first major piece when you enter the tour, it's this set which gives you information on the whole Muskets and MegaHertz exhibition. Now, the Muskets and MegaHertz exhibition is a derivative of a project we are running here from the Department of Physics on finding sites of enslavement in Ghana. So one of the issues was that the main focus of stories about enslaved people and the enslaved institutions was focused on the castles on the coast of Ghana. And these are the major castles, Cape Coast Castle, Christian-Born Castle, Elmina. And these are huge. So usually they are imposing and then everybody is always seeing them. So anytime you hear people coming to Ghana to hear stories about enslavement or the transatlantic slave trade, you see that they will move to the coast and visit Cape Coast Castle or Elmina Castle. Now, as part of this project, we wanted to use geophysics, which is a part of physics, combining geology, computer science, mathematics, and physics, to be able to uncover sites that have hitherto not been seen or have hitherto not been characterized as sites where slavery took place. So we've been on this for about 3 or 4 years now. We've done the southeastern part of Ghana. Now, this was focused on a fort in a town called Otiam. So Otiam is a town on the coast of Ghana from Accra. Before you get to the Mankesim roundabout, Otiam is in the Kumfi district on your left. Otiam is also known to be the hometown of our former president, Professor Ivan Saka Mills. May he so rest in peace. So Otiam is quite well known in that sense. Now, in Otiam, we have a fort that has entirely been forgotten because this fort is totally flattened. If you go there, you won't find anything to show you that this is a fort unless you are looking carefully. So in choosing our site, we wanted a site where we can first use the methodologies that we've developed over the years in looking for artifacts or signs that maybe this site is related to archaeology, history, and in this particular case, anything to do with the transatlantic slavery. And then also, we wanted a place that had not been touched before so that we can then test these methodologies. And then once we do that, we can also bring the history to life. Right. So that is why we chose Otiam. So in Otiam, there's a totally destroyed fort. This fort was built in the 1720s by the British Royal African Company. During the transatlantic slave trade, before colonizing took root, companies were the ones operating site of trade in terms of the castles and the forts. So we had the British Royal African Company in the 1720s building a fort here to serve as kind of a transit zone in between Accra and Cape Coast, which were then major hubs. And then they were hopeful, of course, that they would make money out of whatever trade they will have with the locals. So this was in the 1720s. It was a military outpost and it was also an outpost for trade. The fort is called Fort Tantum Quarry. It's called Fort Tantum Quarry because the old name of the town is Tantum. And then the quarry from which they took the rocks to build the fort, combined that with the old name of the town, became Tantum Quarry. Now, the oral history shows that this fort was not habited for a long time, only a few decades. And then when the British realized that it wasn't really profitable, they decided to abandon the fort. Now, the story goes that when they were abandoning the fort, they wanted to sell it back to the local community, but the local community was not interested in buying the fort. So the oral accounts from the community says that then this fort was bombarded or they set up some form of explosive device to totally destroy the fort. So that's the oral account. Now, on that site, just to give you a summary of what we did, we combined a couple of different methods. first one using drone technology to take images across the site, to look at particular areas of interest, to look at even the footprint, the area size of the fort. And then we also use that to find areas that we think would be interesting in terms of further investigations. And then after we did that, we used geophysical methods to restrict again, to delineate places that we thought were potential areas to find artifacts that would give us some historical perspective about the site. Then after we used the geophysical methods, which I'll introduce as we go on, the next step was that then we went to traditional archaeology. And then once we applied the traditional archaeology, we're then able to excavate and validate our methodology, but then also find artifacts that are related to what we were interested in. So this was the method. A couple of the things we found have also explained here. So if you look to my left, then you'd see that the objects that we found local pottery, we found fragments of European alcoholic beverages, we found mollusk shells, European ceramics, we found a door hinge, and the most important thing of all was that we found musket ball, which from our research so far is the first documented find of musket balls from a colonial heritage site in Ghana. Then we found roof tiles from when the building was there, lime mortar fragments, English red bricks, coins, which are local like granite stones. Yes. And so these are a couple of the things we found. And once we go through the tour, we'll be able to take a look at some of those things for you to experience some of the things we found. Just to take a minute, like I mentioned previously, the project is a project that was funded by UNESCO to us through the seed grant for new investigators in Africa, right? And then this was funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research. So we are thankful for the funding. And then the research team comprises people from KNUS Department of Physics, Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies in the University of Ghana. And also we had the KNUST photonics team that did the photogrammetry studied for us. The curatorial team for this exhibition combines people from the Faculty of Arts at the KNUST Museum. And also we had a team in terms of those who put the exhibition together from the KNUST Museum and the Faculty of Arts, specifically the Department of Painting and Sculpture. So that is the integrated nature of this research. It covered physics, archaeology, history, and then at the end, to showcase the results, we utilized artists and also creators from KNUST, which is one of the things we want to emphasize, that when different fields come together, we are able to uncover stories in a multidisciplinary nature. So that gives you the introduction. Our next stop is to look at, we are moving to my right, and we start the story from here. So we start from an artist's impression of what the fort would have looked like when it was built in the 1720s. So this shows you a pictorial view of the fort. Now, once we go on, all of the things we discover is that we find a little bit of discrepancy between what the artist's impression is and what we actually found from our studies on the ground. But the initial artist's impression shows 4 bastions at the 4 corners of the fort. It wasn't really a big fort, but this covers the artist's impression of the fort. So this was what it would have looked like in the 1720s. Now, interestingly though, today, if you go to the site, what you find standing there, the only things that show you that it was actually probably a fort are these very few remains. Now, this is a wall that is still standing. So you see, that is the only wall that is really standing on the site. It's still that same wall around here. The other major thing we found is a cistern. So the cistern here, a cistern is where, for most forts that were built, they always made sure they had a place for fresh water. Of course, fresh water was important because they needed fresh water to survive. And most of the forts were near the coasts. Even though there was water in the ocean, you couldn't use that to drink. So they always made sure they built a cistern, usually as part of the foundation, hewing into the natural rocks or using bricks to put that together. So we located a cistern also on the site, and then the walls that are outstanding. So these are the only remaining structures on the fort. Okay, good. The next thing, now once we found those on the site, we could now zoom in to our site. The first major thing, like I mentioned, was a huge drone. We took drone images across the site. Now, the town itself is somewhere here, but the imprint of the fort is just here. So there are still some houses near the site, and then the coast is somewhere towards this side. So the wall that I said is still standing. It can be seen here. That is the wall here, right here. Okay. Now, this is a general image. So we use the drone image to be able to identify the imprint of the fort, which covers the whole of this side. From this side, you can see that imprint once we took the image of the fort. So that helped us to look at the interesting places we thought could be on the side. For instance, this is the opening of the cistern. And these are the places that we excavated on the site. So that gave us a good idea of the site itself. Now, for the work, I said it was a combination of different teams. So this is a team in the field. We have the archaeology team, which is made up of students from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, our technician, and then the team also from the Department of Archaeology in University of Ghana. We also had some of the locals helping us with the project, which was actually a key part of the project. To do proper heritage studies, you need to involve community members because they would have knowledge that they can pass on to you. And also it helps so that when you are doing the project, of course, you don't encounter any resistance from the community. So we had local community members helping us, for instance, here with sieving the materials that we excavated from site to be able to find small fragments or relics that we may not see immediately. So that, and this is the team taking a picture of some of the excavated relics we identified on site. Now, here as well, you can see some of the relics as we were excavating. So for instance, you can see the musket ball here, which I'll talk about later. And then we can see the tools that archaeologists use to be able to pinpoint the artifacts in situ. And then you can see an example of our excavation pit as well. Yes. So this gives us a good idea of the site. Now we are going to take a few minutes. If you have any questions, please type them, and then we move on to show you some images of the fieldwork before we move on to the artifacts. Just type your questions in the chat box. I'll get to them. We want to be able to assess how useful the tour has been. Thank you. Okay, so they've given me a couple of questions. One of the questions is, what is the current ownership arrangement of the site? Okay, so that's an interesting one. So the ownership of the site right now it's owned by a family. So for instance, when you went there, adjacent to, you can't farm on the plot itself because there are still smithereens, rock fragments from the fort. But just close to it, we have a couple of cassava farms, maize farms. If my team can zoom in from the aerial photographs, you see that we have a cassava farm here. Maize had just been harvested from this side. And then this side, we also had some maize farm as well. It's owned by a family. So after getting to the community, you have to contact the family. Then the family had to call a family meeting. We had to interact with them and explain to them what we wanted to do. And then once that was done, we also had to then go to the site and ask permission from the ancestors to be able to access the site. So we had a whole ritual and a ceremony where we bought schnapps and the libation was poured. And then once that was done, we were able to get to the site. The other question is, how did they store water in the cistern? Yes, rainwater. That was rainwater that was stored in the cistern. So if you go to most of the castles and forts, they had a really good system of catching rainwater and then directing this into a cistern so that that can be stored as fresh water for a long time. Okay, so if there are any other questions, I would have them. So one of the things we need to point out is the field work that it took. We're in the field for more than 1 week. And like I mentioned, there were a couple of different methods that were used. The first method is the drone. So this is the team running the drone shots, giving photogrammetry shots of the whole place. Then the other methodology we use is the resistivity method, which is a geophysical method. I'll explain that in a second. And the other method we used was the ground penetrating radar. Now, to explain a little bit about geophysics. So geophysics, like I mentioned earlier, is a combination of physics, mathematics, computer science, and geoscience or earth science to be able to image underneath the earth. And with geophysics, we can do that non-invasively, which means you don't need to dig into the ground to be able to know what is under the ground. So if you've ever used groundwater, if you've ever used any petroleum products, if you've ever used any derivative of minerals, probably there was some form of geophysics involved in identifying where that mineral is, where the petroleum is, where the water is before drilling or before we go and take the material from the ground. So we can apply this methodology to check a particular site and see if there are relics under the ground that you can utilize. So in this case, we're using two specific methods, which are resistivity and ground penetrating radar. Resistivity is an electrical method, and what we mean by that is that it is based on applying electric current into the ground. So just like the way from your basic science, we know that if you are running current through, let's say, wood, if you hold a piece of wood and somebody connects it to an electric current, you will not be shocked. That is because wood is resistant to the flow of current. But if you are holding a piece of metal and somebody connects that to a source of electric current, you receive an electric shock because a piece of metal is less resistive to the flow of current. The same thing applies to the earth. The different things underneath the earth react differently to the flow of current. Now, what that can help us do is that it will help us to image materials based on their reaction to the flow of current in the ground. So resistivity method helps us to do that. We run a current through the ground, we connect a cable to the various parts of the ground, and then once we pick up that current again, we can use that to analyze where the current passed and what exactly it passed through. And that can help us to identify what is in the ground. And we'll show you an image of some of the results we get. The other method we use is the ground penetrating radar. Now, the ground penetrating radar is a form of electromagnetic method. And what it does is that just like if you look at yourself in the mirror from your basic science, you know that you see a reflection of yourself with light going into the mirror and coming back to you. The same way we can send pulses of electromagnetic waves into the ground. And once they hit different materials and surfaces under the ground, they are reflected or diffracted or refracted back to the equipment. And we can receive this radar, and then once we get that, we can create images of the subsurface based on that. And that is how those two methods work. And the third thing we did was, of course, archaeology, which was supervised by the Department of Archaeology in Legon. So that's traditional archaeology. Once we identify the places that we thought had a high potential of us having artifacts, then we went into action to then dig those sites and then find those. So that covers the field work we did. You can see the whole team, the community members, the University of Ghana team, and the KNUST team as well in the field. Right, so let's move on. So this gives you an example of the archaeological pit that we dug and how we excavated the various elements of that pit. Now, a map here shows you where Ekumfi Otuam is on the Ghana coast. So if you are moving from Accra towards the Cape Coast side, Ekumfi Otuam is somewhere here, and the Fort Accounting Quarry is right at the coast, a few meters from the coast. So now that gives you an idea of the whole methodology that we used. We'll touch base again on the geophysics equipment and some of the images from there. But the next part is the really crucial part, because that puts all of this together into the artifacts that we actually found in the field, right? And that starts from the next session of the exhibition. The first thing is examples of European pipes that we found on the site. So from most of the sites we visited that are connected to Europeans, one of the very first things you find is European ceramic pipes. So an example of that is put up here. And this usually will let you know that there was an European settlement here, because the locals often did not use this kind of artifact. We had local kinds of pipes that were used. Okay. Now, if we zoom in here, we can see some of the artifacts again from the field. These are the mollusks and shells from the fort. So these are some of the shells that we found on the site. So an interesting thing that you realize is that for most of the sites that you go to, they use lime from seashells and materials they found on the beach to use as a binding material for the bricks and the rocks that they put together. So for most of the old sites of what you go to, you find a lot of shells. Some were bent shells that they were picked up and then bent and then mixed up to create lime, which was used as a binding material for that. So we found a lot of these shells and mollusks on the site. So this is one of the major finds we made on the site. The other thing we found that is interesting, these are European ceramics from the site. So you can see that, again, if you go to a site that had European occupation, you usually see ceramics different from the local pottery. We'll see that in a few minutes. Local pottery usually does not have designs and paintings and all that. So you can immediately see that this is European pottery from the side. This was excavated from the first pit that we dug, which had a lot of these materials on the site. Now, the second one we wanted to highlight here, the second one here is the bottles. And this you can actually see there's a difference in these bottles because they were much thicker than the normal bottles you see for alcohol right now. So these are bottles of European origin, probably for storing alcohol. And we found a lot of these pieces as well. Now, to zoom in on some of those artifacts, the artifacts are actually here. The artifacts here, down here, show you the bottles. They also show you the ceramics, and you can also see the different fragments of smoking pipe stems as well. Okay, so you can see those artifacts right here. Okay, so those are the artifacts from the find as well. You can see the beverage bottles, the ceramics, and also the fragments from the smoking pipe stems, and then the European ceramics as well, used as pellets and all that. And those are available here for sighting. All right, good. So these are all the artifacts, and these are all from the excavated pits, proving conclusively that we actually were able to see. So again, just reiterating, those are the ceramic, the pottery, the beverage bottles, the ceramic bowls from the Europeans, and then the fragments of pipe stems and bowl. Good. So we'll move on to the next one. We take a short pause. If there are any questions, please put them in the chat before we go on to the next stage. Still looking at some of the artifacts that we found. So there are two artifacts that I want to highlight here. The first one is we found a hinge pin. So the hinges of the doors, because they had huge doors for the fort. And then we found a pin that locks in the hinge at the fort. And this was also excavated at the excavation pit 1 as well, based on the geophysical methods. Now, the other major thing are these chunks of lime mortar that was used to hold the different stones and bricks together for the building. Now, I want us to zoom in on some of these artifacts, which are right here. Yes, so you see the actual artifacts, the hinges here. Then we also found local pottery. And the interesting thing is that we found this local pottery in the same place that we found these other things that are of European origin. So you can see the difference between this local pottery and the previous European ceramics that I showed, because the local pottery was often very functional and not necessarily decorative or for designs, right? And then we also found roof tiles in the same location. So a combination of materials. Then examples of the lime mortar fragments that I talked about, which were derived from bench shells, is also found here. Now, the most interesting thing is also we found a quern. So a quern was like a grinding stone that was used for grinding materials. For us, the interest here is because there were a combination of all these materials in the same excavation pit, which meant that the combination, Europeans were not living probably differently from the locals. So people were living mixed situations with maybe local members either being slaves or just servants, or maybe as a part of the fort system itself. So these are the materials we found in this particular pit. Now, we'll go on to now the actual major discovery. It's actually a question I want to take before you do that. Oh, okay. So this is an interesting question, Tom. How do you confirm the identity of these items? For example, the beam for the hinge on the gates. How is that different from maybe something that was on a transport vehicle or in storage? So the archaeological team, for instance, based on previous studies and based on excavated materials from different forts and castles across the country, can tell you some of these materials. So for instance, the pin, you can see the joint where it fits into the hinge at the top and the down. And then I think we've been to other sites, for instance, Princess Town, Kipos Castle, Elimina, where you see similar material. So that is where that comes from. So once you see the piece, the relic, you can actually place it in context because they have had experience in identifying some of these artifacts over time. That's a good question. Good. So here I wanted to highlight one interesting thing. Now, I'm sure a question that will be on the minds of a lot of people was, okay, how do you then know what from geophysics where you should dig? So this is an example of the image we get from, let's say, resistivity. These are actually from two different areas of the fault. Now, the image we get it from, for instance, the resistivity survey is that you get a distribution of the resistivity. We model the resistivity variations in the ground. And once you get a resistivity variation set up like this, you are looking for what we call anomalies. Anomalies are something that shouldn't be there because you expect maybe usually the subsurface is a nice layered structure. So if you find something that seems to be out of place, then it should be because there's a foreign material in the matrix in the ground. And so you see that we have arrows pinpointing some of those matrices, some of these anomalies. For instance, we have this very high resistivity section here, and then there's an interface, for instance, in between the high resistivity section. And just to point out, the high resistivity sections are the bright colors, and the low resistivity sections are the dark colors, right? So here, for instance, you can see a clear interface between the low resistivity section and the high resistivity section. And then you can see something that looks like an abnormally high resistivity section. And the same thing goes here. Here is a bit more layered than the bottom. So then we look for those anomalies, right? Because then those anomalies point to something else. For instance, with the find of the major highlight of this exhibition or this research, which is the musket ball, we found that at the very, very high resistivity sections. So that is the example of how geophysical, the data that we have will look like. And then we use that to interpret exactly. So the idea is that you take this across many lines, across the whole site. And then once you interpret all those lines, it pinpoints where you should focus on. Now we'll take a minute to focus down here on the actual equipment that we use in expressing this. For those of you who will be interested in taking a bite at geophysics in future, you can see the equipment that we use. This is an example of a ground penetrating unit. So if you've seen the images, you see that the lady there was pulling a unit as a backpack, right? This is the unit that we use as a ground penetrating radar. So it would have this. We have a receiver and an emitter in here. So we emit the electromagnetic signals, and then we receive them again in that form of reflection pattern. And then we interpret that to tell you what is in the ground. This gives you the screen that gives you the image. And then once we get the image, we download that and we process. So this is the ground penetrating radar. Now, for the resistivity section, the resistivity equipment is here. So we have a unit which we use for measuring. We have electrodes which we put in the ground to transmit the current into the ground, and we connect all that with cables which I'm showing here. So these are the cables that connect that, and then you have to do a little bit of manpower by hammering this electrodes into the ground, right? And then once you hammer the electrodes into the ground, you connect these electrodes to the cable using these jumpers, and once you connect them, the flow of current goes through. We use car batteries to be able to transmit that, to generate the current that we want to transmit to the ground. Now, after telling you the geophysics, now I would want us to focus on some of the results, the significant results compared with other studies around the world. So the integrated methodology that we were promoting in this study, that we were working with, it's a combination of drone photography. First, you select your site, you do your drone photography, and then you have your geophysical surveys in this case, which is the resistivity method and the GPR. And then once that is done, you process the data, you interpret the data. And once you interpret the data, you then go on to traditional excavation. Now, one of the things, and once you did traditional excavation, you found materials, you documented these materials, archaeological relics, which we then use, which we then, of course, show up here as validating whether the method works or not. At the center of all this, in this case, which is a key lesson we had to learn the hard way, was community engagement. Now, community engagement is key because for most of these heritage sites and historical sites, the community will probably have oral accounts of things that have occurred which you did not know about. So in the middle of all this, you constantly have to engage the community, right? And the interesting experience we had when we started out doing these projects in other parts of the world One of the places we went to was southeastern Ghana, where our community engagement was not that effective. One of the things that happened was we reported to the site, we had a team all in the bus ready to do the geophysical work, and then the community said that we first had to buy a white ram because the site was a sacred site. Right. And then we had to also buy some alcohol. And then after we bought all that and then they prayed, the priest then said that the gods didn't want us to go on that day and we could only go on a particular day. We were there on Monday, which was the next week, Sunday. Of course, if you have a team of people sitting in a bus, hotels booked, eating food, it's probably a huge deal to say we would wait for 1 week before we can go to the site. And because they said the site can only be entered on each Sunday, which meant you can't effectively do any work. So from those prior experiences, we learned that from the beginning, you have to do thorough community engagement so the community is involved. They can give you all the rules. And then they are also active participants in the work. So in this case, we had community members as part of the field crew so that if anything was coming up, they could help. And then also during the project, we always made sure anybody who was passing and was interested in what we're doing would explain what we were doing to them. Now, once we did that, the methodology, and these are the equipment I'm showing here, the quantified results, which was something else we did with this project, was to be able to quantify the results. So usually for archaeological applications of geophysics, for most research results, what you read is we were looking for some relics, we found the relics. But in this case, we wanted to quantify our results. And how did we do that? Once we did the geophysical surveys, we tried to classify the places that we thought were potential areas where we can get relics. And then once we did the excavation, we then earmarked the exact locations we found these materials and then compared the two to see whether we actually saw the materials exactly where they were or there were some overlaps. And in this case, our detection accuracy was 83.3%. There was only one other study we saw that had actually done any quantification of detection accuracy. And the best case scenario for their results were around 60%, which meant that our results were far better than that benchmark. We also realized that we had 18% efficiency gain. Why? Because we reduced the excavated area by 95%. So usually the archaeologists will do this probabilistic choosing of sites to do some form of excavation, and that could go up to 25%. In this case, the site we excavated, if we quantify that in relation to the whole site, was about 5%, which means we've reduced the reduction by 95% of what you should probably be doing. Okay, and now the climax of all that is that for the very first time, we documented the first find of basketballs on an archaeological site in Ghana. So we found 4 basketballs, 2 each in each of the excavated pits that we had. And that will probably be the next thing that we'll focus on. Oh yeah. Okay, so another question from Tom. Are car batteries the standard or modification to allow mobility? Car batteries are the standard for doing resistivity work. In mineral exploration, where they are doing there's a variation of resistivity called the IP methods, induced polarization. So they use that in mineral exploration where they need to cover huge sites, kilometers, and that sometimes they use generators for that kind of work because they are covering kilometers and you need a lot more current. But for our uses and on this limited sites, car batteries are the standard. So we found the musket balls, 4 of them, 2 from each excavation pit, and these are also on display here. The images here, 4 of those musket balls. With various diameters up to 1.8 centimeters. Yes, so you can see the musket balls in there. So we had 4 of them. And now you know why we are saying Muskets and MegaHertz. It's a geophysical detective story, because then the story integrated geophysics, and one of the major finds that we had was this musket balls from the study. So this, for the very first time, recovered musket balls. And I'm sure for most of you who have gone to forts and castles along the coast, you've seen cannonballs, but you've not seen musket balls on those sites. There were various degrees of musket balls and materials that were used as projectiles. So some were musket balls. There are recorded episodes of people using stones or any piece of metal to put in muskets and fire with gunpowder. But these are the first documented actual musket balls on the site. So that gives you a good perspective of what we did. The final thing that we want to focus on is some of the tools that were used by the archaeologists, which is the main part, because without the archaeologists, we couldn't have validated our methods. So you can take a look at some of the tools that the archaeologists use, and I'm sure you've seen them in the images. And that gives you the final part of the tour with the pans, the tapes, the pins, the measuring tools, and the compass, and then the whole team again here for you to see the work that has gone into this. And the other thing we did also was to give you a good idea of how what usually happens in the field. You cordon off the place that you are working in so that you will not have people stepping in there at will. And then you have your tools to work with in the field. So those are the various tools that we used. But anyway, so this gives you a summary of the Muskets and MegaHertz Exhibition for those of you who could not make it to Kumasi to experience the tour. And then the team will try to get a 360 of the whole room while I take a look at the questions. Oh yes, so can you kindly tell us the name and probably the model? I'm sure this is a geophysicist accent. So the resistivity meter we use is the Abem thermometer SAS 4000. And for the GPR, we use the Mala GPR system. And the antenna we use the 800 megahertz for the field work. Okay, so there's a Tom, how viable are these musket balls? So the variable, I'm sure you are not asking in terms of money, but in terms of the archaeological find. So when we're doing this, at the time we're in the field, I'm a geophysicist, so I didn't recognize the ultimate significance. But then for the archaeologists and the heritage studies, they were very fascinated because this was the first documented find of musket balls on an archaeological site or a colonial archaeological site in Ghana, which makes it quite significant, right? Because one of the things you can do in future is to then look at the kind of musket balls and compare them across the site. And that can also tell you the source of the muskets, the particular people, for instance, who traded in those muskets and which ones were used in Ghana. So it is quite valuable in terms of archaeology. Yeah, Tom, I hope that answers your question. So we are going to do a slow 360 around the whole site so that you get a good perspective. But as we do that, if you have any questions, please send them into the chat box and I can answer those as well. So when you enter the exhibition room, the first thing you see is the setup for the archaeology. There are tools, an image of the team that worked on the site. And then from there, you go to the main board that gives you the whole story in one piece, and that is the Muskets and MegaHertz geophysical detective story. So we characterize this as a geophysical detective story because the main tool we used was geophysics to be able to investigate the archaeological and the heritage study. And that gives you a summary of the origin of the fort, where it was, the team, and then the objects that we found. Then the next thing you see is the map of the place. Unfortunately, we have a lot of pillars for aesthetic purposes, and that is now a challenge. But you can see an artist's impression of the building, of the fort, how it was when it was built. And then the next thing is to see how it actually is now, the remains that are there. Right by the artist's impression, you can see how the building looks. The only things remaining, which is another thing that we found at the end of this project, very interesting, because if you compare that to other sites in other archaeological colonial fort sites, the ones that have naturally degraded and are unlike this particular one, because usually you will find that the degraded forts naturally degrade over time, and they are not totally scattered to smithereens. In this particular site, we found that the whole site was scattered to smithereens, apart from this wall that was left, the partition wall that was left, which of course confirms the oral account of the British intentionally destroying the fort as well when they were leaving. The interesting research question that needs to be asked in future is that, how was this done? Was this from bombardment from the ocean, which is what the locals mentioned, or was this done by explosion on site? We, for now, are more leaning towards the explosion on site because the materials were scattered over a large area. And we thought if we had cannonballs being fired from the sea, the materials would just cave in and not be scattered into smithereens over the area. Now, from there, then you move on to the aerial view of the site, a drone view of the site, which gives you a good perspective of how the site looks right now. It's at the edge of the Otuam town, like I mentioned. The Otuam town is in the Kumfi district and is the hometown of our former president as well. It used to be called Tantum. So the fort that we were working on is called Fort Tantum Quarry, which is a combination of the local name Tantum and then the quarry from which they took the stone for building the fort. Then the next thing is to show you how the field work was done. So you see the team working in the field, running the geophysics, the drone, and then also the archaeology on the site, which captures that. Now, the next thing after that is to then capture the actual relics that we found to validate the methodology that we use. So for the relics, we start from the European pipes, ceramic pipes that we found. And usually when you find those, then you know that this site was occupied by Europeans. We also found European ceramics, which is unlike local ceramics or pottery, because local pottery was more functional, so it didn't have a lot of these colorful designs on them. So you can distinguish that from European pottery. And then we also found beverage bottles, really thick beverage bottles, unlike the modern glass bottles that we use. We also found a lot of that in the excavated pits. The next thing was also, for instance, the hinge pin that I mentioned, and then the lime mortar. So I mentioned that in those days, 300 years ago, they were not using cement as a binding material. So what the Europeans did is they got a lot of shells on the shore, and then they bend these shells and then use them as a binding material. So we saw a lot of that. That holds the stones or the bricks together for the building of those forts. And then we also ventured, I showed you how we interpret, an example of how we interpret those geophysical images. So you can see an example of the geophysical images, the resistivity image, and how we interpret that to be able to tell us, delineate exactly where to look for materials. And then we did a short stretch on geophysical tools. So I showed you the kind of geophysical tools we use, the ABEM, the Mala GP radar system, and also the electrical resistivity system that we used. Yes, which we utilized in the field. The resistivity meter is the ABEM thermometer systems, SES 4000. Then I also gave you some of the quantified results, the actual integrated methodology, the importance of community engagement, and also the quantified results compared with global benchmarks that we saw, and that captured that as well. And then finally, for the climax, which is the most important discovery on the site, was the musket balls that we found on the site. 4 of them, so from 0 to be able to identify 4 of them on a single site, should tell you how significant this project was. And that gives you a good idea of the Muskets and MegaHertz Exhibition. For those who missed the whole show, were not able to come to Kumasi, we hope this gives you a good perspective of what the Muskets and MegaHertz Exhibition was about. But we also are hoping that we can keep on doing this work on multiple sites. There are a lot of sites across Ghana, apart from the forts. We have over 40 forts and castles in Ghana. And of all this, the last time we quantified it, only 3% have been investigated with geophysics. Apart from the forts themselves, we have lots and lots of sites across Ghana that were also connected to the transatlantic slave trade. This is especially important now that Ghana is leading the effort for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. It means that we really need to understand how the trade occurred, how people benefited, how people suffered, how it affected communities, how it displaced people, the demographic changes that occurred across the country. We can only do that with research by finding the sites across the country. And so apart from even the forts and castles on the coast, right across the country, from the north of the country to the coast, there was a whole network for slavery, which means that we need to be able to understand all of those sites. We need to be able to map those sites. We need to be able to find the artifacts on those sites and uncover the stories around those sites. Thank you very much for listening. So type your questions if you have any questions. Would appreciate it very much if you can let us know what you learned from the exhibition, and then suggest possible ways of improving the exhibition as well. I've not seen any other questions in the chat, but if you have any other questions, you can also reach out directly to me at any time or send a message if you want to share anything that you've gained from the project as well. I want to thank everybody that joined, but most importantly, we want to thank those who made the online tour possible. GhScientific, AfroScience Network, and then the Ghana Institute of Geoscientists. The initial idea was just to have an actual physical exhibition, which is still running. Would extend it beyond 31st March. So it's still running at the KNUST Museum on the campus of the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, in Ghana. So anytime you pass through, you can still go through there and experience it for yourself. But we thank all those who gave us the opportunity to showcase this also online for those who are interested beyond Kumasi to be able to experience. Thank you and have a wonderful day. See you later.